Marvel Snap just announced their newest set of series drops. Let's take a look at what's entering Series 4 and Series 3 in Marvel Snap. First things first, these are the cards that are going to be entering Series 4, meaning effectively they will go from costing 6,000 tokens in the token shop to costing 3,000 tokens in the token shop. Second thing second, these changes are set to take effect on June 4th was what was communicated to us. So these will be something that are going to be happening in the very near future, but are not live right now. Now let's start into the cards. First, dropping into Series 4 is Nebula. And I think this is a card that a lot of people are going to want to pick up. Nebula is a former Season Pass card that is one of the strongest one-drops in the game. While it does have a fairly awkward matchup into Kitty Pryde decks, Nebula has actually been seeing something of a resurgence as of late, as there have been more decks that don't necessarily want to be playing a lot of cards on the final turns of the game and really just want to be playing a 6-drop. I've seen a lot of Nebula Blink type builds. Nebula has been an all-star in Clog decks. Nebula has been an all-star in these newfangled Doc Ock decks. Nebula is a good card to have, and I think knowing that she's going into Series 4 from here on out is a good thing. This is the kind of card we actually really want in Series 4, where it's not an archetype enabler, it's not like one of the best cards in the game, but it's just a solid role player to all-star level performer in a large variety of decks. In the current metagame, Nebula mostly shows up in Blink decks, she shows up in Doc Ock decks, she even shows up as the 1 or 2 non-ongoing synergy pieces in the ongoing Spectrum deck. Nebula, of course, is one of the cards in the game that is the most likely to be the most power for her cost. The ratio you can get with this card is like effectively you can get up to 9, right? Like this is a card that can be a 1/9 if you end up putting it in a location that your opponent simply can't play on. It also pairs well with Jean Grey, another card that we'll talk about later, as she is also dropping into Series 4 here. Nebula, I think, is actually kind of a highlight. This is a card that a lot of people will enjoy getting for a smaller amount of tokens when they actually have to spend tokens. This is a card that was borderline worth 6,000 tokens, that they actually did drop into the 3,000 token bracket. Now, as far as this actually changing the dynamics of Nebula, I'm not really sure that's true, because she's still going to be in caches. Caches sort of effectively make there be very little difference between Series 4, and Series 5. However, I do think it's good that they're moving a card like this down. This is not the kind of thing that I would feel super comfortable paying 6,000 for. It's a borderline case. And so in those cases, if we're accepting that there's not really a lot of difference between 4 and 5, I definitely like they're experimenting with a new price point for a good, not great, but just very good card. Seline dropping from Series 5 to 4. Frankly, all I can say about this is that I'm disappointed it didn't drop from Series 5 to Series 3. I do not think this card is worth purchasing at the 3,000 token price point. It obviously was not worth purchasing at the 6,000 token price point. I would honestly, if I got it for free, be a little bit upset because I got this card instead of something that could actually be useful. I don't really know what they should do with this card. I think this one might have to go on the long-term rework list because this ability is not appealing to people. This type of playstyle has been part of the meta for a while now. Like the goblins have been running around. A lot of clog decks have been running around. This is the meta where she should make sense, and she just doesn't make sense. She's just not a real card. They recently she's actually like in the most recent Spotlight cache at the time of making this video, which is just before they switch over the Spotlight caches. So I get what they're going for. I think if I had to like intuit some hidden rules to series drops, my thought process would be, and I haven't double checked these, but these feel right to me. The first one is every card before dropping a series needs to be in a Spotlight cache, and Seline just was. And then the second one is they will never double series drop. Those are like the two, I guess I would say what feel like unspoken rules that I've sort of noticed to how they've been doing these series drops. As far as I know, they have never dropped a card that has not rerun in Spotlight caches, and they have never dropped a card from Series 5 to Series 3 directly. I think Seline would be a great time to start doing things like dropping a card from Series 5 to Series 3 directly. This is not a very good card. It's not a very appealing card. I don't know what they should do with it other than rework it maybe, but if you're going to rework it, why drop it at all? So I guess we're just going to sit here and look at this card being fairly mediocre for the rest of her lifetime in Snap. I don't really know. Silk is a sneaky good drop here. Silk is a card that is, or was, I should say, typically played in the silky smooth move decks, right? And so going from Series 5 to Series 4 makes her a little bit more of an obvious pickup because those decks haven't been extremely good for a while now. They ended up running into like a major brick wall in the form of Loki. When you are playing cards that are like all great on rate, a Silk, a Craven, things like that, and then the rest of your deck is just like really good cards, you run into this brick wall that is Loki. When we talk about Loki being a mid-range killer, the silky smooth deck is actually the mid-range deck that it's killing almost archetypally. Like, that's the kind of thing that is very bad into Loki, because the way it works is you both play like a fairly equivalent early game, and then they play the card Loki, and then they play every card you've played from turns 1 through 4. They just play all that on turn 5. Like, you have a 2/5, they have a 1/5, right? You have a Spider-Man, they have a 2-cost Spider-Man. Like, all of that stuff ends up really working against the silky smooth archetype. And while you can run Mobius for the matchup, you still have to draw it, and you still have to feel good about it, and there has to be enough upside in playing a deck like that. The major thing that Silky Smooth was really good at doing was responding to the meta pressures of the time. And I think this is a good lesson for people who want to take old decks and then just bring them into the new metagame and be like, this is going to be good. The thing about Silky Smooth, the thing it was doing was very specifically countering Zabu Darkhawk decks that were built around relying on Shang-Chi and to some extent Enchantress. What it was doing by being a deck that was going small enough to not get Shang-Chi'd but still have a lot of points on the board and having no Enchantress targets was blanking 2 cards in the deck. And when you are blanking multiple cards in that deck, you are able to have a good matchup into it. It was a very meta-dependent choice. Silky Smooth, people talked about it coming back after the Angela reversion, and what ended up happening is just there are better things to do with Angela now. Shang-Chi is no longer in that dominant spot either. Like, it's still a very good card, but people are playing a lot of Leech right now and a lot of combo decks that don't really give you the opportunity to Shang-Chi anything. That sort of the lesson of Silky Smooth as to how to beat Shang-Chi has almost percolated throughout the metagame, making Silk herself sort of superfluous to requirements in this context. Now, I don't think Silky Smooth is like unplayable, but this is another card I think I would have liked to see go down into Series 3. I think this is an okay card to put into Series 3. I don't think the deck is all that good, and I think it would be nice to have like all upgrades to the move package in a meaningful way in those early Series 3 pools. However, I also think there's an argument that your average Series 4 card is more easily acquirable than your average Series 3 card for someone who's just entering Series 3. Because when you're entering Series 4, when you're entering Series 3, at least you get to like look in the shop and be like, I'm getting Silk for 3,000 now. And that might be like very expensive, but at least you know it's there. Whereas if you were just to try to open it over an extended period of time, or like unless you use your free Series 3 on it, it is actually kind of difficult to get a specific Series 3 card. So maybe there's some argument for keeping it in Series 4 on those grounds. I think it's a fine Series 4 card, but I think it would be a better Series 3 card. Jean Grey getting dropped after a buff is a good sign for me. I think it is a good thing that Jean Grey is receiving a series drop despite getting a buff, despite being like a really playable card right now. Jean Grey is like a key piece of the ongoing Spectrum archetype, which is not my favorite archetype in the world, but it does exist and it is playable. And making it cheaper on the whole is a good thing. There are multiple cards from that deck that are getting dropped here. Both Nebula and Jean Grey go in that deck. I think that's a really good thing to do. I think that the fact that they buffed this card and then dropped it anyway, also a sign of good faith for me. I enjoy that. Now, I will say, again, not a huge difference between Series 4 and Series 5 for me that I can see. I think that the rate of token acquisition is so slow that it ends up being a situation where it's like, are we really going to spend 3,000 twice on something less, or are we going to get a blue chipper like Jeff? And, you know, maybe that is a reasonable critique to have of the actual differences between Series 4 and 5, because outside of that token aspect, there's not really a huge difference because of the way they both show up in spotlights at effectively the same rate. Now, the other thing about this, though, is that I think it's very easy for me to say, like, they're dropping these good cards into Series 4 means that two of them actually kind of are competitive with Jeff. Like, if you were like, I'm going to get Jean Grey Nebula, I'd probably still rather have Jeff. But, like, let's say you already had Jeff, you can get Jean Grey Nebula, like, that's pretty good. You can get, like, Nebula Darkhawk's a really good thing to pick up, right? Like, there's, like, good cards in Series 4 now. And I think making it a little more competitive between whether you're buying one 6,000 token Series 5 card or two 3,000 token Series 4 cards, making those Series 4 cards good, I think, is impactful. I think in most cases, Jean is still not necessarily good enough, but it's a good thing that the volume of playable meta cards in Series 4 is increasing, and Jean is helping this trend. I do actually give them extra points for doing this right after they buffed the card. It would have been very easy to be like, we're buffing this card, let's keep it in Series 5 and see if people buy it. I appreciate that they didn't. Gladiator. Gladiator is a strong card that is not in the best time frame for itself right now. And what I mean by that is this card is very good and has been very good, but in recent metagames, it has not been as good. This has been a little bit more of a specific run card, a card being used for specific scenarios, than the generically good 3-drop that it was a few months ago. That said, I do think it's a fantastic drop. Gladiator is a card that more people should have, and I think especially the way in which this card got dealt with by the balance team does sort of indicate to me that you'd want to be a little bit more aggressive dropping it than other cards. And what I mean by that is this card was released as a 3/7, and then not only did it get buffed, America Chavez also got reworked so that it was no longer in the deck all the time when Gladiator was pulling stuff, which was a major problem with him. So they effectively gave him 2 buffs in quick succession that made him a competitive and viable 3-drop in basically not every deck, but like a lot of decks. And while other 3-drops have certainly caught up, Nocturne being a great example of what you could be doing instead of Gladiator, I do think that it is good that they're willing to say, look, we get it. We buffed this guy late. You didn't really have an opportunity to get him. Let's move him down a series. Now more people can actually play with him. I do think, he's definitely not as good as he was. Like, we've had a lot of good 3-drops released recently. I just pointed out Nocturne, but even something like Hope Summers pushes you away from being a 3-drop type deck. But you will play this in Silver Surfer. You can play it in a variety of like sort of tempo-y decks. Like the Supergiant deck tends to enjoy having this card in it, in as much as you can still play that. There are a variety of good uses for this card. I think right now specifically, people are worried about Leech. I mean, a great way to combat Leech is play things that have on reveals that you don't love. This is a great card to get leeched, this and Maximus. I know that there are people who have been playing decks that are sort of predicated on the idea of I'm going to play a bunch of good stats and be like a solid mid-range deck, and then if my opponent leeches me, I'm actually just 100% happy with that. This is a card that can go with that. I think it's good that it's dropping. I'm a big fan of Gladiator. I hope more people are able to pick him up. Is this guy a counterpoint to that unwritten rule that I thought existed? I'm going through it right now, and I'm kind of thinking, wait a minute, have they ever put Hercules in a second spotlight cache? Is this the first card they've ever downgraded without him showing up in a second spotlight cache? I don't know. I think maybe. I think this might be the first ever. And I think this is, of all the drops, I get it. People are going to be mad about a lot of stuff. This is the one that gives me hope because it is May. This might take effect late May. This might take effect early June. They've been pretty vague about timing, even though their Discord announcement does say June 4th on it. This is a card that was released in January. Getting downgraded a series by May is like a pretty good thing, I think. And that does sort of remind everyone, of course, how far we've come, right? Like these used to be like cards that would get downgraded in 2 months, right? But also we had like much worse methods of actual acquisition, by which I mean we had basically no methods of actual acquisition. And so I think that there is something to be said for the speed with which this card was downgraded. If I'm like totally hallucinating that he's never been in another spotlight cache, let me know. I could be totally hallucinating this, but if that is true, I'm hopeful, right? Because that means that there are other cards that are more recent that they can just be like, hey, let's get rid of this guy. Although I will say, One of the awkward things about this type of drops, and when I look at these drops, what I'm seeing mostly is they're dropping cards that are not amazing. They're like, honestly, I do think these cards are better than like if they just dropped everything that sucked. These cards are definitely better than that, but they keep not making any cards that suck, and I worry that that's going to create some awkward incentives for like dropping things in the future. Like, how do you choose between whether or not you're supposed to drop Pixie or Mockingbird? Like, I have no idea how you're supposed to choose that, right? So that said, Hercules is one of like the last legitimately cards that they've made because they've been on such a roll design wise. I've talked about this in other videos. And I'm glad that they're dropping him. I really are. I think that I really am. Jeez. I think that's a good thing. And I'm happy to see this guy move down in series because normally this is the part of the video where I talk about what decks you can play him in. I don't think you should play this guy in any decks. You can play him in like maybe some move stuff and do some move combo stuff, but I don't really get the sense that's a lot better than doing beast type stuff on the turn you'd be playing Hercules. So yeah, I probably wouldn't really invest in him even at 3K. Living Tribunal getting dropped makes Living Tribunal pretty much a budget deck now, which is pretty cool. I think that there's pretty much just this card, and then in some versions, you're gonna need, like, depending on how you build it, right? Like, there's like MODOK Tribunal. There's like the version that's playing Miss Marvel as your alternate onslaught hit. But like, it makes this deck, this is a archetype build around, right? This is an archetype build around that people actually want and people want to play. And I think Living Tribunal holds a very special place in the metagame as the deck that is a combo deck that just goes drastically taller than everything else. Like, we have, since I would say probably December, a lot of Marvel Snap metagames have looked sort of similar in general dynamics, which is there is like the typical good points in interaction deck, and then there's like some combo decks that are just like, suck it, points in interaction deck. You can't interact with me profitably, and I have more points than you. And I think that one of the things that really kicked that off was Living Tribunal really kicking off in December, showing everyone that you could just ignore these kind of points in interaction decks. You didn't have to be like that. And Living Tribunal has always been the biggest of those combo decks, the deck with the highest point ceiling. So in a metagame full of Hela, you whip out Living Tribunal because one of the things that the other combo decks have, Phoenix Force, Hela, they don't have interaction for you. So you end up being able to just say, all right, well, if you're not playing interaction and you're beating all the decks that play interaction, I'm going to beat you by also not playing interaction and just going bigger. And Living Tribunal has always sort of had that role for the last 6 months as just like the break glass in case of everyone playing combo kind of deck. And I think you can totally do that. I think that is a super valid thing to do. I don't necessarily know, like, you're going to have to judge metagames as they come. Like, is this the right time for this? Is the real question you're going to want to ask about Living Tribunal decks. But yeah, I mean, this is a good card. I can't really describe it any other way. It's a time-limited and kind of specific metagame call card, but it's a good card, and I'm glad they're making it cheaper. Now the drops to Series 3, and these are effectively just cards you're probably going to get for free. Like, going from Series 5 to Series 4, not a big deal. Really, like, it's a big deal in the sense of if you have tokens to spend, but because of the rate of token acquisition, I have gathered, I wouldn't know, I have 60,000 tokens, so I'm just trying to like get in the mindset of someone who doesn't. I have gathered that it's not the biggest deal to go from 5 to 4, but it is the biggest deal to go from 4 to 3. Going from Series 4 to Series 3 creates free cards, effectively. Everyone who has Series 3 complete will get all the cards going into Series 3 for free. Everyone who doesn't have them complete, there is actually another issue. Because now all of these cards are entering Series 3. Maybe you're still looking for that Wong or that Death or whatever it is, and you're getting these cards instead. I think that's an interesting issue they have yet to solve. However, I do think that on the whole, making cards free is very good for the players of this game. So I'm not going to get too bogged down in the Series 3 bloat issue. I do think there's things they can do to alleviate that. But unfortunately, a lot of those things do amount to, hey, give us another free card. Things like that. I'm not really entirely sure, but I am interested to see how they manage that issue in the future. That said, I think these are effectively going to be the biggest and most impactful changes in this patch. So let's get to them. The first of them is Echo. I know a lot of people don't like Echo. I know even in a metagame that's very heavy ongoing, she's not seeing a lot of play. I am interested to see if that changes when literally everyone has her. If everyone has this card, and I don't mean literally everyone, I know I'm using it literally to mean figuratively, get mad at me in the comments, grammar nerds, but I think that this could be a card that is due for not necessarily a reawakening, but people are going to try to play this card. One home that this card absolutely does have without any question at all is Cerebro 2. Anyone who wants to play Cerebro 2 would have been hard-pressed to find anyone who says, yeah, it's totally a good idea to spend tokens on Echo. It wasn't. But now that it's free, this is a good card for Cerebro 2. Howard the Duck finally dropping out of being expensive or any money spent on this guy in any way. This is not a good card, but at least now that it's in Series 3, people can stop pretending that it's a good card because there's a price tag attached to it. This is a card that is fairly mediocre for the base reason of you typically want to run it in a Jubilee or Iron Lad deck. I just hit the mic, I'm leaving it in. And when you run a Jubilee or Iron Lad deck, you know, it's cool to know what you're going to get off that stuff. It really is. Jubilee, Iron Lad, Blink, it's super dope. The issue you run into is that you're going to have the Howard in your deck. And it's easier to build a deck so that all the hits are good than it is to have a Howard in your deck making your hits bad. You Jubilee a Howard, you feel like crap. You Iron Lad a Howard, you feel like crap. Like, this is the sort of fundamental issue, is that he's meant to serve as this, like, pseudo deck smoothing tool, or at least an information tool so you can make these random rolls not random, but the better way to make those random rolls not random is just build for them to be beneficial for you more often, as opposed to putting in a card that weakens the potential of those rolls in order to raise the potential of those rolls. I want to like this card. I think Howard the Duck's a funny character. I want to get that Infinity Gauntlet variant. Like, there's cool stuff going on here. There really is. I do not currently like this card. When I think of Marvel Snap designs that have more or less totally failed, Martyr is pretty much the card I come up with. I don't remember anyone being excited for her ever. I don't remember anyone really playing her in any real capacity ever. And while I think that that has sort of arrived at this point of, like, maybe she's actually underrated now, she's not a particularly good card, but I am hopeful that people will realize that she's, like, not the worst card in the game. There are far worse cards in the game. Martyr's biggest problem is actually, like, her numbers. Specifically, being a 1-cost card is very awkward. If she were, like, a 2-6, a 2-7, that's suddenly kind of an interesting thing. And, like, I've played against decks with Martyr before, right? Like, this is a card that you can play in Zoo decks, and Zoo decks are pretty okay. Like, there's nothing necessarily wrong with her. She's like second Ant-Man in those decks. It's just, it was very hard to justify ever spending anything on her because you have Ant-Man. What do you need her for, right? Like, there's a lot of situations where she's just worse Ant-Man. That sucks. That sucks. It's not worth spending tokens on. It's not worth opening for. It's not worth any of that. Now she's free, I think people are actually going to notice that she's a little bit better than they think. Like, I'm not saying this is going to be a card you're going to see everywhere, but one of the major issues with Martyr was she cost money, and now she doesn't really cost money. Mirage is a banger of a card. This is a good, great even card. Just a useful piece of information, just a card that I've played in decks even that weren't low-key, just because I was like, I need a 2-drop. This is like a pretty cool thing to be doing. I've done that. It's not like the greatest thing to ever do, but I've done that. This is just a good card to have lying around. It is a card that I feel like is roughly competitive with Series 3 power level, and especially now that Valentina is in the Series 3 or Series 4 and 5 mix, there's no need to have this and Valentina in it, which I kind of suspect was perhaps a motivation for the drop. Like, that would be like, all right, what do we need both of these in here for? You're going to buy one or the other. We don't want to make you buy both. So let's drop Mirage, and I think that makes perfect sense. It's a great card to drop. I'm a big fan of Mirage. She ends up seeing a decent amount of play. Obviously, she's mostly a low-key card, but I'm not going to complain about them making a card I actually like free. This is also a good drop. I like Silver Samurai being dropped because of all the cards that have been dropped from 4 to 3, this is the one that's closest to being an archetype enabler, and it's also the kind of card that enables an archetype that made it not worth purchasing. And I think that's just a really, really awkward position for cards to be in, where it's like, yeah, you know, you could play a new deck kind of thing if you got this, but also it's kind of bad, and that puts the deck in a situation where it's not worth purchasing to optimize, which makes me wonder if maybe there's some untapped potential in Silver Samurai, because this is the kind of thing where it's like, you know, I don't think necessarily a lot of people have been playing like Silver Samurai X23 deck and disruption decks. Maybe they're better than we thought, and we just didn't want to invest into them because not enough people can buy Silver Samurai. Not enough people got the brain trust working on it, you know? That's entirely possible. Now that he's free, I'm interested to see what he does. I'm not saying like, oh, he's obviously going to be way better than you think. I just think that like I'm interested to see what a card with this sort of dynamic around him can do in a real metagame. All right, so I gotta tell you, I was originally a little bit disappointed in this series drop because I thought they should just drop more stuff. Going through it, I am generally I'll give two levels of impression. First one is I think that they dropped some legitimately solid cards from Series 5 to Series 4. I don't know if that matters. The second one is I wish they'd been a little bit, not necessarily more generous with dropping from Series 4 to Series 3, but I wish they'd picked, you know, some more unique and interesting cards. And if they didn't do that, I wish they'd just done more, right? Like, I guess my thought process is there's this issue that is happening wherein we get 5 cards added to Series 4 and 5 a month. And then once every 5 or 6 months, 5 cards drop out. And it's like, that doesn't seem sustainable to me. I do not feel as though it is sustainable to go another 6 months. We currently have, after this drop, we're going to have, I think, 69 cards in Series 4 and Series 5. And there's going to be another 5 or 6 months. So of getting 5 cards added, we're going to end up at almost 100 cards in Series 4 and Series 5 by the time they do a series drop. That feels super unsustainable to me. And the reason that feels super unsustainable to me is the time that forces them to take between cards showing up in spotlight caches. That's the number one thing that I wish they would address with the system, is the pain point of, I have the money, why can't I spend it? Why can't I spend my money on your game? I want to spend my money on your game. Why can't I do that? And yeah, I don't really have a good answer for why that would have to be like that. And in order for them to make up for the amount of cards they're adding, they need to drop a commensurate amount of cards, and they have not done that. So while I am impressed with the individual granularity of this, I don't think it sort of meets the moment. The moment, by that I mean like, the video I did about how they keep releasing good cards and what they need to do to aggressively address that involves aggressively dropping the bad cards down. Aggressively, in order to keep the number of cards in Series 4 and 5 a relatively lower amount. It doesn't have to be 40, it can be 69. I think that's fine, but it can't be 100. I don't think it can be that. And I think that that is the most worrying thing for me about the series drop, because on an individual level, they dropped good cards to Series 4. They dropped at least some interesting cards into Series 3. I'm glad people are getting 5 cards for free. I think that's dope. But how do you manage the larger dynamic here of it takes 5 months for, like, Pixie to show up again, right? Like, that sucks. That sucks, and I don't know how to fix it other than getting cards out of those Series 4 and 5. I just don't. I think that's like my one critique, where it's like, I feel like this is a perfectly fine, even a good series drop, but it doesn't necessarily meet the moment in the way I would have wanted. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. It ended up a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. I was going to be like, oh yeah, I'll just jump in here. I'll jump into the booth. I'll cut a quick 10, 15-minute video. It was not that. So I appreciate anyone who made it this far in the video. You may notice I am home. I am home. I am very glad to be back in my house and like have a functioning stream setup. So yeah, I'll see y'all all on stream. Thank you so much. Remember to like and subscribe. I really do appreciate that. I've been KM Best. You've been phenomenal. I'll see you in the next one.